Okay, here I am in Max 9.0, and of course, I don't know if you're using 2014. It's still pretty much the exact same thing. It's just where things are located in Max are different because it's a different version. But here I've called up Max 9.0, and I'm going to now import that converted FBX file. So here we are in. I've gone up and clicked on File, and of course Import. Selected Autodesk FBX as the file type, and of course I've navigated to that V5 folder. This is the 9.0 version of the FBX file that are originally exported from Blender. I select that and of course select Import on it. Now once I do that, of course it throws up this dialog box asking what we want to apply and change and stuff. I leave every single thing in this box alone except for one, where it says conversion. It always says converting 2 inches, and you have to click on the down arrow, the drop down menu box, and say no conversion. You don't want FBX to convert anything at this point. You want it to leave it alone. So that's the only thing I change in this box, is I change it from whatever it's defaulted at to no conversion. And of course, if everything went well, you'll suddenly have it popped up in your scene here, which I've got the 3D scene more maximized than the other 3 views. You'll also see that blend root here. It's that square located in the middle of the grid over there. And you'll notice that the meshes that have popped in here, this is this is the linking room for the Great Zero. You'll notice that they're translucent looking. Like I said, for some reason FBX changes the material's translucency, the opacity I should say. It changes it to 11, every single thing to 11, and I don't know why. But it's fine because it actually helps me. So the first thing that I do, of course, is I get rid of the blend root. Now I'm zoomed in here to the actual link-in room for the Great Zero. And like I said, as you can see, all the meshes are rather translucent looking because their opacity has been set to 11. So what I'm going to do is show you how I use that to help me. The first thing I do is I select one of the meshes that I want to work with. In this case, I selected one of the walls of the link-in room here, and then I go to isolation mode. I isolate it so I can, nothing else is in the way. That's the very first thing I do. Next, I right-click on it and I change it from an editable mesh to a editable polygon, and that's because we need to apply smoothing groups to all the polys. So after changing it to an editable poly, I click on the poly faces, and then I just click and drag my mouse over the whole thing, select every single poly that's on it. Then I scroll down over there on the right hand side till I get to the smoothing group buttons, and I click on auto smooth. That's all I do. What this does is it straightens out any normals that seem to have gotten messed up. If you don't do this, the textures are really going to look screwed up. It's going to look like one-sided objects. Half the faces are flipped the wrong way and everything. This corrects all that. It makes everything look just fine. Once I've done that, I then right-click on the object again and change it from an editable poly. I change it back to an editable mesh. That's really important. It has to be an editable mesh. So right-click and convert it back to an editable mesh. Now it's time to make this thing visible and start applying the textures to it. So what I do is I hit the M key to call up the material editor, and of course I say get material, and I use get from selected. And as you can see, the FBX conversion carried over the name of the material. And on this wall, there's a bunch of different materials on this wall because they've got old paint, peeling paint, metal, rock, all sorts of stuff on here. And hang on a minute because my cat's walked in front of the mic. Alright, sorry, cat walked in front of my mic. Now, the next thing that I do at this point is, as you can see, it's a multiple material. And I told you, back on Blender, it'll list the materials in the same order. So it makes it convenient for you. So I'm just going to go ahead and select the first material on this, the material ID number 1, and go with that. Okay, so when I call up that first material, we see in the opacity box that it has the value of 11, which explains why it's translucent. So, and I've circled it in green here. So what I do is I change it, of course, to 100. We want the opacity set to 100 on this. As a matter of fact, we really, in Unreal, we depend on the material to make a mesh appear translucent if we want it that way, not actually here in Max. So just about everything should probably be set to an opacity of 100. When we do so, of course, it'll turn that specific channel on this mesh black, as you can see in this image here. So now that area, that channel is going to have that particular material applied to it with this texture is now black. So now let's apply the texture. Now, I don't know about you, but as much as I like Uru and have spent over a decade exploring Uru and everything, I don't have every texture or what things look like in my mind. Just don't. So normally I have Blender running in the background while I'm working in Max, and I'll go back into Blender and select the same mesh that I'm working with in Max and go to the material editor in Blender and make sure I'm on the material number. And once I've done that, I then click on the texture button so I can see what texture it is. So here I've clicked on the texture button that's next to the material button, and as you can see, it shows me the sample of textures there. But all the way over there to the right in the last box, it actually gives me the path and the full name of the actual texture bitmap that we're going to use. So I can write it down or just memorize it. So now I go back into Max 9.0, which I can't leave minimized for more than a minute or two, because if I do, it will no longer come back up. It's like the program freezes, probably because it's a 32-bit program running on my 64-bit computer. So, but anyway, call it back up, we go back into Max, and now we go into the material, and of course we want to apply the diffuse color, which is going to be our bitmap or our texture. And so, I call that up and double click on bitmap so I can go pick it. So the dialog box opens up so I can navigate to where the bitmap is. And in this particular case, like I said, we have all the textures that were imported when we imported the age in that temporary folder. So I navigate it and I find the texture map image that matches the name of what was in Blender. There it is, pick it, select it, and now I've got that bitmap select for here in Max. And of course, once we get the bitmap selected, we make the material visible by clicking on the blue and white checkered box up there. And now, as you can see, the bitmap or texture is now applied to the mesh, and we can actually see it. From that point, we could then start taking a look at the UV mapping to make sure that nothing was messed up, which does happen occasionally on a face here or there, but not on every single mesh I've found. In this particular case, I would probably go through and finish applying all the textures that I can. When it comes to blended textures, I don't really do that. I'll put in the base texture because I know that we're going to do a lot of the blending and applying alpha textures and height, things like that. We do all that in Unreal. We're not really going to do it here in Max. The only thing we're doing here in Max is we're applying a texture so we can double check the UV mapping to make sure that everything looks okay. So let me go over a couple of things again here for just a minute. Now I've got the Great Zero called up, part of the Great Zero, and that I've been working on. And here's part of that huge machinery controlling arm thing that rotates and stuff. And as you can see, we've got this curved arm, and it already has textures applied to it. And that's because some of the meshes may share materials. And if they share materials, when you apply a material to one mesh that you're working on, it may suddenly pop up on another mesh. That's okay, it's because it shares a material. Whether we want to do that in Unreal or not is up to you. So with this control arm here, I'm going to isolate it first. Now we've got it isolated, and as you can see, the texture mapping on it looks really screwy. I mean, it's like, oh my goodness, what has happened to this thing? What has happened to this thing is you have normals pointed the wrong way, and there's no smoothing groups on this mesh because the Blender 2.49 version of FBX didn't know what to do or doesn't have smoothing groups automatically applied. So that's where we do that, converting it to a poly and putting in our own smoothing groups like this. Now, as you can see, the textures on this look a lot better, and that's because I right-clicked on it, said Convert to Poly, and then I selected all the polys on it, and then I scrolled down, and in the Smoothing Group section, I clicked on Auto Smooth. Then I right-clicked on it once more, on the object once more, and converted it back to an editable mesh. And as you can see, the textures look a lot more beautiful now. Nothing looks screwed up. That's because all the normals are now facing the correct way, and we've added smoothing groups which are needed. So it looks really cool. Now we got to do something about the UV mapping. Now, looking at the textures, it should be obvious that there's UV mapping already there, and there is. But if we don't actually put in a UV mapping modifier, when we export from Max as an FBX to Unreal, when we open up Unreal, it acts like there is no UV mapping on the object whatsoever. I don't know why. But we need to put in an extra UV mapping modifier, even if the object does not appear to have any problems with its UV mapping. If it does have a problem, you locate that face and you remap that face just fine. It only takes an extra few minutes. But we have to add at least one UV mapping channel modifier. I use the unwrap UWV on this as the first modifier. Now, once I've applied the first UV mapping modifier, it's obviously UV map channel number 1. At that point, I have to decide if I need to put in a second UV channel or not. Unreal requires a second UV channel to apply light maps. So obviously, if the object is something emissive, like a light, something that obviously a shadow cannot lay across, like a light glow of some sort, something that is emitting light, or glows brightly, it won't have a shadow across for it. Therefore, when in Unreal, in the materials, we're going to say it's emissive and no light map's going to be made for it in the first place. So those objects, we don't need to create a second UV channel. However, as in this case, we have an object that's solid, it's not emissive, and it needs to not only cast shadows, but it has to have shadows casted on it. Therefore, it needs a second UV channel for Unreal. Now, Unreal can create a second UV channel for you, but it kind of does it in a messed up way. It doesn't always work, especially with large objects. So everybody that works with Unreal in the forums and everything says that you should create the second UV channel in your 3D graphics program. So I add a second unwrap UV modifier to this object, and of course it pops up and says, okay, do you want to move the groups and stuff? You click yes here. I think Max 2014 it says something else about moving it. You just say okay or yes. And of course that's because you've gone over and you've told it this is now channel number 2, and that's important to do that, of course. Then once you've done that, you need to select your faces on it. Now that I've selected all the faces for the UV mapping on this object, which is real quick, okay, and you need to make sure you have all the faces mapped for the second UV channel, okay. The way you want to map it is you want to do a type of flatten mapping. This is what I do. I tell it flatten. And that's because every single face has to lay inside the texture square. It has to reside inside that texture square, and none of the faces can overlap. If any of the faces overlap or they're outside that texture square, your shadows are going to be all screwed up on this object. So I just use the mapping. Now, there's room to do a lot of fine-tune adjusting here because in Unreal, I did some reading where a lot of people were having issues with shadow bleeding on corners of objects and stuff like that. For now, we're kind of in a hurry, and I'm doing this quick and dirty, so I just go with the default flapping map and say there it's done, it's got its second UV channel. Once I've done this, technically I'm done with this mesh. So here I've unisolated the mesh. As you can see, it's got its 2 UV channels, and this is where that translucent thing helps me. If I see something still translucent, I know I haven't touched it. I haven't done anything to that mesh and I need to work on it. If I see that it's got textures, it's not translucent, but the texture looks all screwy on it, then again, I know, oh, it must have been sharing a material and I haven't touched it. I need to work on it. Then, like I said, there can be, like, for example, if you look in this picture in the back, on the back wall, we have the light fixtures. They didn't have any screwed up looking things, and even though you still have to apply smoothing groups, they looked fine. The way I can tell whether I've done work on something or not is when I select the object, I look in the modifier groups, and if I don't see that I've applied a UV channel, it means I haven't done any work on it. Everything should have the UV channel. Also, do not collapse your groups, your modifiers. Do not collapse them. I don't know if it shouldn't affect anything, but it helps me, remember whether I've worked on something or not. So I'm done with that mesh. I then move on to a next. Once you fall into a routine, it gets pretty quick. Once you've done either the part of the age you're going to do or the whole age, you need to scale up. And this is where I do the scaling up, because in Unreal, it's 16 Unreal units to a foot. So what I do is I select everything in this scene, everything. Then I, of course, select on the scaling, and I go down to the bottom and do the absolute scaling, and in the X box I type in 1600, because we're scaling up 1600%. And what that does is scales everything by a factor of 16. Once I've done that, then I can do an FBX port on all the selected objects I want to export, and it'll snap in place in the Unreal. And that's how I go from it being an age to Blender to Max and then into Unreal. I don't really think I need to do a video in Unreal. Even if I do, I gotta wait because it's got a 4 GB update I've got to do tonight. So that's it. If there's anything you don't understand, just let me know.